Hello gamers, Agafor here with part 2 of the science of bleeding. In part 1 we discovered that the minimum you can bleed per second is 5, and while running you lose 50% less blood per second. In this video we'll investigate ways to reduce the bleeding to 5 per second and take a detailed look at the different types of bleeding in DayZ Standalone. Before that, we need to find out how much we bleed per second from different body parts with melee and ballistic damage. Melee first, we tested the following body parts: chest, back, legs, arms, feet and head. Here are the results. With melee, we bleed at 5 blood per second from every single body part with the exception of the head. Now ballistic on the same body parts. As we can see, the results vary quite substantially. We couldn't test the head or back because the Sporter 22 one-shots players in these locations. We even tried it with protection to the back and the head. The ballistic helmet does stop the test dummy from dying in one shot, but it never made the test dummy bleed from the head. From these results, I'm starting to suspect that the bleeding debuff intensity is based on the initial blood damage a weapon causes on a player. Let's go deeper. Do clothes reduce how much we bleed per second? For this experiment, we shot our test dummy in the chest while wearing a pristine hoodie, and then again with a pristine t-shirt. The blood loss per second without clothing is 20 per second, and with clothing, 10 per second, so clothing does reduce the amount we bleed. Let's get this blood per second even lower. From our How Items Protect Players experiments, we know that a pristine t-shirt, chest holster and child briefcase provides the maximum amount of protection a player can gain. We shot our test dummy with these items on 5 blood per second. From this, we can roughly assume that for every item of clothing we have on a certain body part, the blood per second we lose is halved per piece of clothing. Just to double check that the blood we lose per second cannot go below 5, we stabbed our test dummy with a t-shirt on, again 5 blood per second. And now to see if we can reduce the blood per second of a stab to the head with a mere baseball cap. Without a hat, the blood loss per second is 15. With a hat, 5 blood per second. So getting your hands on any type of hat will reduce bleeding from the head to its minimum of 5. However, does clothing reduce the blood loss per second while you wear it, or is this blood loss per second simply based on the initial damage? To test this, we equipped our test dummy with a baseball cap again and stabbed our test dummy in the head, much like the last test. This time, however, we removed the baseball cap after the initial stab caused bleeding. 5 blood per second. The result we just got would indicate that weapon blood damage may affect the intensity of the bleeding debuff. If this is true, then clothes do not reduce the amount of blood we lose per second. Instead, they reduce the amount of blood damage caused to a player. To get a finalized answer on this theory, I got one of the most powerful guns in the game, the Blaze. Now we know the Sporter 22 causes 10 blood per second on a naked player's leg. Now to test the Blaze on a naked player's leg. 15 blood per second, that's an increase of 50%. From this, we can assume that the Blaze 95 does 50% more blood damage than the Sporter 22. And more importantly, that blood damage does dictate how much you bleed per second. Let's work out how blood damage is converted into the bleeding debuff. 5,000 is the maximum blood we started with, minus the seconds it took to die from the second our test dummy was shot, 233, times the blood per second we discovered, 15, equals the initial blood damage of the Blaze 95 on a naked player's leg. So 5,000 minus 3,495 equals 1,505. The seconds it took to die from the initial attack is probably a fraction of a second off, so I'm going to assume that the blood damage of the Blaze 95 is exactly 1,500. So the Blaze 95 on a naked player's leg causes 15 blood per second, and the initial blood damage is 1,500. It's easy to see that 15 is 1% of 1,500. So we can assume that every weapon in game applies a 1% bleeding debuff based on the blood damage of that weapon. Looking back to the Sporter 22, we can now calculate that it inflicts 1000 initial blood damage, as it caused a 10 blood per second bleeding debuff. The best way to nullify the bleeding debuff is wearing clothes that reduce the chances of the bleeding debuff being applied to you. In combat, bleeding is something that causes you to go completely passive to stop the bleeding. During the time it takes to stop bleeding, we are extremely vulnerable to attacks, so reducing the chances of getting the bleeding debuff will benefit anyone greatly in combat. Looking through the game files, I have found the best protection to reduce the chances of receiving the bleeding debuff for each body part. For the head, any helmet is great at reducing the chances of bleeding. The gas mask and payday mask also protect you a little bit from the bleeding debuff. For the chest, back and arms, the combination of the rider's jacket and anti-stab vest is the best. No other vest like the anti-stab vest provides protection against the bleeding debuff. Backpacks do not protect you at all from getting the bleeding debuff. They will only reduce the amount of blood damage caused. The combination of the rider's jacket and anti-stab vest also provides the maximum amount of protection from ballistic damage in game. This is not much, however. As for the legs, the jeans you spawn in protect you the most against getting the bleeding debuff when you're attacked. Shoes offer no protection against the bleeding debuff. As a conclusion for the science of bleeding, there are not different bleeding effects in DayZ, such as heavy or light bleeding. Instead, all bleeding debuffs are 1% of the initial blood damage inflicted on the player. The minimum amount you can bleed per second is 5. While running, the blood per second you lose is reduced by 50% to a minimum of 5 blood per second. The amount of blood damage is closely associated to the amount of health damage a weapon inflicts, so guns of higher caliber cause more bleeding per second. When you are attacked, clothes not only reduce the chances of you receiving the bleeding debuff, but also reduce the amount of blood you lose per second, making clothing even more important to your survival. Clothing that is ruined does not reduce the blood damage of an attack, therefore the blood you lose per second will be greater. There you have it, the mysteries of blood loss demystified. While the information in this video may not help you a huge amount, it paves the way for our future experiments. We know how blood loss works now. In saying that, next Sunday we are revisiting our body parts experiment to find out how much damage each body part takes in relation to each other. This test is going to be much more accurate this time. If you learned something, give it a like. Thank you for watching, happy bleeding, and I will see you in the next video.